Please, if we have a chair for this panel here, Mr. Kolawole Laya. Okay. Sorry, when I entered and I saw the photo, I thought maybe session going on, but because the policy to be around it, and we have to go with it. So we are going to have a session. Who is in charge of it? So I would say yes, it can begin. Okay. Again, good morning. I apologize for staying outside. When I came in, I thought this place was quiet and serious, so my something was going on. I was waiting for you guys to show up so that we could take over and start. So again, I apologize. So the title of our panel is doing history of films, Nollywood, history, and cinematic films. This is the first part of the panel. And then we have, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 presenters. And I would like to call them to please come up here so that we can start in knowledge. Professor Victoria Apolio, please come here. And then we have Dr. Julian Fresh, equally. Is it here? Oh, yeah, right. Okay. And we have Dr. Sumilayo Muson, and she's online too, right? Okay, I know she's she was presenting from Georgia State University in the US. And we have Dr. Samson Amunuako. Now we in the years, Dr. Nicola, how are you online? Okay. Let me hopefully they'll be coming to So what we are going to do is we'd like our presenters, when each person finishes presenting, because oftentimes forgets the question they want to ask. So if the questions are lumped together, at times it doesn't really work. So our choice is that at the end of the presentation, we will give you guys at least 5 minutes to ask questions. So what that means, please don't ask. Do you have a slide or so when you're ready?
Didn't see it when you what? And this is translation. Good morning, everybody. My name is Okwe Apolewu, and I am presenting on the topic, the labors of art, typically downplayed or even distorted the history of women's contribution to the development and even the very independence of Nigeria. And for me, this constitutes a form of gender injustice, where I'm sure many of you, by the time we begin to ask you, can you name the nationalists who advocated, who fought for Nigeria's independence? You are going to be mentioning Nnamdi Azikiwe, Obafemi Awolowo. You are going to mention. I don't know whether you are able to mention any feminist figure, any female figure who was a nationalist, who fought, in the front lines with these people. And so for me, this is a form of gender injustice, where the contributions of women to the development of Nigeria has been marginalized, has been distorted in some instances. And it is on this note that my paper argues that we should or we can conceive of Nollywood, the Nigerian film industry, as a constructivist memory space. And as a constructive memory space, it is a model, or it is a retelling these stories. We're able to pass on a unified history that talks about, the contributions of both male and female in the Nigerian society. And my paper sets out to answer 3 questions. First, how does Nollywood construct and reinforce gender roles in its historical and fictionalized narratives? Second, in what ways does Nollywood function as a site of cultural memory and ideological construction, especially when it comes to gender, which is the main concern? And the last research question that this research tries to answer is, how are women's roles in Nigerian history reimagined or reclaimed in Nollywood's historical films? And I start by, just reminding us of what Nollywood is. For those of us who are not familiar, I know that if most of us, if not all of us, are familiar with the fact that Nollywood is Nigeria's movie industry. Have women who are now represented as empowered, independent agents on their own. And it is not just women that this shift has affected. It has also affected men. And you have pictures, for example, I cite the example of Keaton in Kings of Boys, who is represented as somebody that is weaker than his sister. If you look at Gangs of Lagos as well, you see Ife, who also has this emotional side that is not usually typically associated with men. And so they provide evidences of this subtle paradigm shift. However, that if these films exist does not mean that, all is wool. Majority of the movies that are still produced in contemporary times still offer such, stereotypical representations. And so in that line, we look at what Nollywood is as a constructive memory space. And I talk about Nollywood first as a cultural archive, in the sense that in reflecting societal norms, what it does with these movies is it enables the transmission of these cultural norms and values to incoming generations who might otherwise not have come across them. And in this sense, it becomes a vital tool for cultural preservation. It's not many people that go into history textbooks to read up on histories. But many people actually watch movies and, they get the information. And this is where the historical fictionalized movies that I'm talking about come in. When you look at historical films, especially in terms of their function, they are more of artistic means of preserving and reinterpreting cultural heritage. The way that, the stories that we've heard about our forebears are now retold in ways that resonate with us when we watch them. And so they help in influencing public memory, because you see these figures that you have heard about and that you are now seeing represented on the screen. And you might, in some instances, identify with what they are portraying, or in some instances disagree. But however you take it, they help in the influencing public memory, especially playing a crucial role in what is remembered about history and how it is remembered. And it is in that light that they are termed memory texts. These historical films are termed memory texts. Now, the challenge we have with those who make historical movies is what we call the selective historical retellings. Movie filmmakers select the memories or the historical events that they deem worth remembering. They don't give you the whole picture. And usually they're coming from a perspective, they're coming from an ideology. And it is this ideology that influences how they reinterpret these historical events. And so I take you very briefly through some of the movies. I'm not going to talk too much about them. I'm just going to highlight certain things, but I will talk about two of them. And I start with the movie on Funmilayo Ransome Kuti. I'm sure that if you have not watched it, you've heard that in recent times, a movie was made about her. I always tell people that the first time I came across Funmilayo Ransome Kuti was like some 5-6 years ago. I mean, as an activist, especially a scholar activist. What I knew about her when I was in primary, secondary school was that she was the first one to drive a car. In fact, her identity as Fela's mother was just, complementary to Fela. But the only thing the history textbooks told us was that she was the first woman to drive a car. Color me surprised when I began to see books and read about the fact that she wrote articles agitating for Nigeria's independence. She agitated, and then you are all, for those who have watched the movies, you are all familiar with how she organized the Egba women to revolt and agitate against the unjust taxation policies. And so I call it, a reclamation of feminist narrative. I also look at Queen Amina in this same light. Many of us, when we think about Northern Nigeria, we think about, how the patriarchal society, this structure there is even more restricting to women than here. But here you have, a movie called Queen Amina that ladies, girls in those societies can identify with. And then I talk about, well, I'm not going to discuss this. House of Guys, one of the movies I also discussed. October 1 and then the movie 76. These are movies I also talk about in how the main figures are masculine, and you have, the typical representation of the women who are around them, who are just, incidental to them. And so I now look at Efun Shetan Animura. And Efun Shetan Animura's movies are, a prime example of what I call constructivism in praxis. If you have watched the first movie that was made about her, or you've read Akinwumi Shola's play, you know how she was depicted as this cruel, emotionally unstable, and violently punitive woman. But from further research, we learned that Akinwumi Shola himself got all this information just from one page. And he just took a part of that one page and blew it. And that is what most of us learned and knew about her. Now we are the new story that has now come, the movie that was released in 2005, for example, now reinterprets her. And we see that, some of what she did was actually very, very beneficial. And she had good reasons, for ignoring some of what happened. And, that there's a lot of politicking behind the eventual killing. And these two movies, when you juxtapose them, you see how filmmakers can tell stories and make you buy into stories such that you now identify the figures in this way and in that way. And I look at what this implies. As a constructivist memory space, Nollywood is a powerful medium for exploring, reinterpreting, and sometimes reshaping historical gender narratives in Nigeria. The Efuncheto Aniwura case in point. And you see, memory, how we remember things, informs how we identify with our community. And so I argue that in bringing marginalized female figures to the forefront of collective memory, Nollywood is inspiring audiences, especially younger generations, to engage with history in this sense as a living narrative that can inform and motivate their contemporary action. And so I look at how these historical films have been instrumental in shaping narratives of gender representation and cultural identity. However, like I mentioned earlier, all is not yet full. You still have within the Nollywood sphere a struggle with the complexity of the historical nature of female figures. For example, we're all excited to learn about Fumilayo Ransome-Kuti. We're all excited to learn about Amina. But when it comes to Efuncheto, the idea of a moral, nurturing woman who is able to kill those who are pregnant is still, somehow to us. And so it is clear that Nollywood is not merely a cultural industry, but must be regarded as a philosophical space where gender history and identity are contested and renegotiated. And my belief is that as the industry continues to evolve, that the filmmakers ensure that they retell these stories in ways that challenge unjust narratives, in ways especially regarding gender that challenge patriarchal legacies and encourage a more historical consciousness. And this will help these narratives to become pedagogical tools that will help to inform curricula and public discourse. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Prof. That was a very good one for me. And I hope it is for you guys. Concisely constructed and delivered. So, guys, we have 5 minutes. This is a 20 game I mentioned earlier. I would love us to just respond so that we don't, forget our questions. Okay? So, yes.
Thank you very much for that. Number one, very beautiful presentation. Many philosophers have needed to look at Nollywood. My question is this: there's an assumption that what film does is to reflect society. So, from the explanation, at some point you looked at stereotyping women. At some point there was a subtle change with parents, and then you looked at that some corrective to that. Well, the question is do we have something like a theory or something that explains how film, informs the influence society and vice versa?
Okay, that's fine. So please take it.
Yes.
Next. Can someone be looking online to see the
Yes, I'm making sure to see the third question.
All right.
So the question.
My question about 3 or so. One, is Nollywood monolithic? Is there one Nollywood such that in that Nollywood there is a stereotypical representation of women. Does Nollywood have an ideology such that it is patriarchal? Or Nollywood is just contradictory or represents all sorts of things? That's number one. Number two, do filmmakers have any cinematic obligation to represent history or present any historical consciousness? Do they have any such obligation? You do not have, well, I'm sorry, that is going to speak to my own presentation. You do not have cinematic license to project their vision. And that leads to the third one. Is there an Ekusheto and Nura? I'm not querying the historical status of the person, but what can we say about the history of that woman that will be the history of Ekusheto and Nura, since the past is gone, and any interpretation of the past is an interpretation? Thank you.
So that's a this different of that. Good one. Okay, I mean, both of you asked, so please be this.
So our question is on the hero fans. Well, we usually think, I think you also mentioned that things represent society because really instance.
Reflect.
Really reflects.
Yes.
Does it not undermine, does it not promote the argument of the mirror fallacy where you separate the artistic creation of the filmmaker without linking it to the society? Is it possible that a film can be a film on itself? Must we always link it to history? Must we always link it to history, to social realities? Can act be act for itself? That's my question. The mirror fallacy. Thanks.
Okay, next. That'll be the last one.
Thank you very much. Let me say first one. My question is,
You just need to have this one.
okay, so you mentioned that why isn't filmmakers, you know, maybe are things based on sort of selection, set of selection. So my question here is, was that happens in soliciting, happening, historical things? That's it.
How about question? And my question is, when you rise, when you talk about the product, what women, the gentle, caring, loving one, and the other one, I think that's the third one, the shoes. So that's the category in which we have the appreciators of 19 billion.
Thank you. I think that is noted. I did. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'll start. We have a theory on how films influence. Yes, when you look at film theory, there's a whole. When you go to the field of theater, and there's a whole what you call tradition on film theories that talk about how filmmakers using this selective means of telling stories. Sometimes they mainly reflect society, but in reflecting society, they can reflect at this exaggerated nature. Okay. So sometimes you see how in reflecting, people, I agree with what this movie has said, but when you ask them, do you know anybody who behaves like this? They find it very hard. That's where the exaggeration now comes in. But there's a whole lot of discourse on film theory and how this constructivism in films work. I think that answers your question, Dr. Osimiri. Professor Folayan, your first question, is there a monolithic Nollywood? No. From my research, I am using Nollywood just, in a broad sense as a representative of movies or the film industry in Nigeria. If you look at the film industry in Nigeria, there's a lot of discussion, and you can identify three distinct film industries. You can identify Asabawood, you identify Nollywood, and then you talk about Kannywood. And there's a lot of discussion about, whether Nollywood captures both Asabawood and Kannywood. And I don't think there's any agreement, there's any univocal agreement as to the response to that. But as to whether they all present or represent women or gender roles in this stereotypical manner, I think generally, yes. From my research, I am open to learning more if they don't hold their diversions or their differences. But from what I have researched so far, most of them, some more than others, depending on the ideologies that are prevalent within the societies from which the movies have emanated. And then I look at the second question, do filmmakers have any obligation? And I tie that to his question because they are very similar. They have an obligation to retell these historical movies as they happened. No, in one sense, and yes, in another sense. No, in the sense that we can talk about, these creative abilities and the fact that they should be allowed to interpret reality any way they like. But you see, when it comes to historical fictions, especially in this kind of multicultural society, filmmakers must also recognize that they also, as members of the society, have an obligation to ensure that whatever they do ultimately serves the common good of the society. And that is where this yes comes in, which is that they have an obligation to ensure that their depictions of these historical events are made in such a way that benefits whether marginalized groups or whether society in general. That is my response to that. Can we talk about Efushetu and Imura, in the light of the fact that she has gone and we just have historical retellings? Yes, I think to an extent we can. From my research, I was able to learn that Samuel Johnson, I think it's Samuel Johnson that wrote the Bible, was her contemporary. And so even in his work, he wrote about her. And her family members, her descendants have come up with a historical retelling using Johnson's book, Samuel Johnson. Okay, using Samuel Johnson's history or his own reporting of what happened during that time. And it is from there that you now have these new retellings that talk about all she did, that talk about how, she was not as godless as she was represented in the first film that was made about her. So to an extent, yes, we can talk about trying to unearth true pictures of what happened in the past. How true, whether we will be able to succeed with 100% certainty, I cannot tell, but we can get as close to the truth as possible. Okay, do the selections affect the historicity of the films? The selected memories that are retold in this way sometimes do. I gave the example of Efushetu, and I gave the example of the two movies that were made about her. In one movie, she was portrayed as, someone who, even though she was a woman, her actions were contrary to the idea of womanhood, society's idea of womanhood. And in another, where, all other parts, or as much of the other parts of her history as the writers could get, where they were included in the movie, we have a more nuanced picture of a woman who was just suffering and reacting to a traumatic event. And we now also have a picture of all the other things that she did that were beneficial to the Ibadan society. So in a way, yes, these selections do. Last question online.
The question Like,
Yes, so I'm going to read out the question, but I also have a question. Let me read the one from the line five.
please read the one on that because the problem is that time is going.
All right.
Actually, from henceforth, we'll allow all the other presentation.
And then take the lectures out.
Yes.
So the question from the line says, can you say something about the concept of historical themes as memory text? Is there a dialogical or dynamic aspect to this? What is the role of agency, whereby they provoke the re-examination rather than a fossilization of history, providing entry points to challenge certain events that are being presented as historical themes?
I didn't get the last part. It's when you started talking about role of agency.
Okay, question said again, what is the role of agency now? Thereby, they provoke a re-examination rather than a fossilization
A what? Fossilization.
fossilization
Okay.
of history, providing entry points to challenge certain events that have been presented as historical truths.
I think that's the whole point of my presentation, that filmmakers should also recognize this, the agency in retelling and re-examining these events. So I think that should be clear. But as to historical films as memory texts, you see, when it comes to memory, studies have informed us that memory is not just a static phenomenon. Memory is constructivist in nature, meaning what you remember. If two persons experience an event and they are asked to retell the event, they are likely to retell the event not in all the details, but as they remember it and as it appeals to them or resonates with whatever ideologies they are currently adopted. So it is in that light that you have these historical films as memory texts. As memory texts, they are historical events that have now been retold from the perspective of the filmmaker. They inform us about history, but they inform us about history from a particular perspective. Do they tell us all the perspectives? I leave that to you to answer.
Okay, so can you please? As you can see, we have very good discussion, but then our time. Sorry, we'll come back. We'll still have time. Please, I would just like the office to present so that everybody will have time. Again, I'm going to change the sequence. There's the nature of having brilliant present. Okay, Professor Olayo.
Thank you very much, sir. Good morning, everybody. The title of my presentation is Live World, Film Words, and Cinematic License, the worldliness of Nollywood. Yes. And this presentation seems to reject everything that the first presenter said. And I'm glad she went first because that's a very good introduction to my paper, or a good way to present these issues, bring them before you. In recent times, we've been given a whole lot of epics and biopics, that seems to ransack history, that seems to give us an idea of forgotten memories, like my colleague said. And so this is what has led to reflection. And really, this is not a new thing. It is something that almost every one of us here will resonate with. in one way, it's going to distort some of our understanding of how we can come to film interpretively. In another sense, it is going to reinforce what some of us already know. I am simply just going to give us a theoretical way by which we can begin to think about this. Please go to the next slide. So, like I said, these things give to us or throw up for us problematics about how we can begin to think about things, how we can problematize aesthetic materials on the one hand, and the life worlds within which these aesthetic materials are emanating from. And then there are two critical, and those two critical approaches are being the ones that I've attended the first presentation. You have the formal aesthetic approach on the one hand. Let's take film as film. Let's take a text as a text. Let's assume that the author is dead. Let's just take the film and then attend to it, look at its formal, components, look at its aesthetic components, and then pass judgment, interpretive judgment. On the other hand, let's take a film as a social ideological construct. What is it telling us? What should the film tell us? I am going to be throwing a middle part, and I'm going to be saying that a film is in the world, but a film should not necessarily be of the world. That is the essence of the term worldliness that I'm going to be speaking to. Next slide. The immediate context for this is that when Anikulapo was released in 2022, it jump-started a kind of a conversation around the relationship between film and history. And a friend of mine, Professor Bukola Oyeni, wrote a Facebook post that generated a whole lot of comments. And that Facebook post was, compelled him to write another one, more detailed response to that film. For him, the film does not, in his own assessment as a professor of history, African history specifically, does not live up to, the expectation, the hoopla about how great a film is and all that. And essentially because the film failed to take history seriously. And I give us that quotation from. And I've highlighted a whole lot of those things that I highlighted there because Professor Oyeni said a whole lot of things about Anikulapo, said a whole lot of things about how it failed to represent the Oyo Empire in terms of costume, in terms of architecture, in terms of, the regalia of the king, in terms of how great the king is, in terms of, the location of the textile, those who are involved in textile and all that. But the point for me, from those things that I've highlighted, Professor Yeni says he's not a movie critic, but at the end of the day, he passed an aesthetic judgment, a cinematic judgment on Anikulapo. He said from the beginning that there are a whole lot of things that makes a good, great masterpiece and all that, and that Anikulapo does not, it does not satisfy any of this. Please, next slide. Now, I did not give us all the quotes, but in the earlier Facebook post, Professor Oyeni says two things, contrary things. Number one, he says that artists reserve the right to either exaggerate reality or underplay reality for effect and for other purposes. But on the other hand, he also says that artists also have a duty to the truth. That is the question. They have a duty to the truth. How can they, on the one hand, have the right to interpret, film the way they like and bend it to their purpose? And then on the other hand, so the questions, where does the real issue lie between these? How do we manage these two supposedly or axiomatic truths? How ought materiality, being grounded in history, being grounded in culture, being grounded in society, to relate with creativity, the right of the filmmaker to pursue his cinematic vision? A cinematic realism, an authoritarian imperative, must the filmmaker model, mirror, represent reality, represent society? What is the extent and limit of the filmmaker's creative intervention in reality? And now should a filmmaker be judged or adjudged in terms of her decision to tell a story according to her perceived directorial vision? Next slide. So my argument now, or my objective, I'm going to outline an argument that hands cinematic license to the filmmaker without any deference to an objective historical truth. And there is no such deference because, for me, there is no historical truth. There is no historical objectivity. We all come to history from an ideological perspective. Two, my argument intervenes in a way that fragments the way we see the lived world or the life world that films and filmmakers are supposed to imitate, simulate, or represent. There is no such life world. I seek to disrupt our understanding of a reality-bound ontology that distorts the relationship or distinction between reality and fiction. And lastly, the objective of my argument is to enable filmmakers with a cinematic license that allows them to recreate and represent realities in ways that further accentuate human world making. Now, this is where the argument becomes a bit theoretical. We have raised the issue of past and the present earlier. So issues about past and present cannot ontologically and hermeneutically, in terms of interpretation, be settled interpretively. And that is essentially because the past is gone. We see, if you take the Nigerian Civil War, for instance, you see that there are votes that keep coming on what actually happened. We can't settle that question of what actually, who fired the first shots? What was the remote or proximate cause of the Civil War? We don't know. We will keep writing. There won't be any definitive book about history. Two, the fact that human world making, now, in 1957, the Russians launched Sputnik into space. By the launching of that human-made artifacts, the natural order of space was distorted and disrupted. So when you look into the sky, you are not just seeing stars and moon and the galaxies. You are also seeing human-made objects that has entered into that. So when we talk of the Anthropocene now, we are talking about how humans' activity is disrupting reality, is disrupting our world. So when we talk about reality, what are we talking about? The natural reality is being disrupted. We are pushing plastics into the ocean. So that when you get a fish now, you do not know what the fish has ingested when you ingest the fish. So human world making is affecting reality. It's affecting our world, such that reality is now always in the process of making and unmaking. And that is the reality that the filmmaker is supposed to mirror, objectively. There is no objective mirroring. Filmmakers by themselves as humans are also in the process of world making themselves. They have a vision they want to contribute. They have the way they perceive reality that they also want to cinematically project to us. They are adapting filmic vision to an already fractured reality. Humans, all of us, therefore, will live in multiple worlds. Is either the cultural world that we have adapted according to a cultural imperative, or an anthropogenic world that we are building, artificially, that we are making into our own image. Nollywood provides a framework for rethinking the African life world, not as a function or outcome of a rational need and monolithic understanding or ontological unity. No. The post-colonial reality is so many. You have the rich, the poor, you have patriarchy, you have feminism, you have so many things lumped in. That was how I asked the question earlier on. Is Nollywood one? No. Not in terms of Kannywood or Asabawood or no. Nollywood is a contradictory space for so many contradictory projections. So if you look even into whole Nollywood, you see that there are films that project the powers of women. It is not all films that represent women stereotypically. So Nollywood, according to an argument, exhibits a regime of arbitrariness that brings together our lived world, brings together fictional world, brings together so many things. All of these constitute world making. Next, I've gone to Nollywood so Nollywood is embroiled in many words. That's what the concept of worldliness means. That is what I meant by saying it is in the world. By the fact that Nollywood filmmakers make use of materiality from where they are, it is in the world. But by the fact that they use this materiality to now transcend the lived world into a fictional world, it is not of the world. So worldliness also now imposes a responsibility on the cultural critics. It imposes a responsibility on the critic of a film, those who will interpret that film. It introduced methodics that you must be very careful. Unlike our professor, the earlier professor that I mentioned, we need to be very careful about how we come to it, because the film is not just the film. The film is not just more in a particular ideology or so. The film is in the world, but the film also projects its own film world, you know. So to make a film, and I'm quoting somebody, that's the last slide. To make a film is also to construct a world. As viewers, we are invited to enter into this world, to share it with its maker and with other viewers. When made, experienced, and understood as art, the virtual worlds of films, including all narrative ones, not only provide a form of experience that approaches in many ways our actual embodied life experience, but also mediates it in aesthetic ways, sometimes with powerful cognitive and effective end. What I'm saying is, when a filmmaker project, when Anikulapo was made, when Lishabi was made, when Jagun Jagun was made, we must not see them in terms of how well they represent history. We must also see them in the open and possible worlds that they open up to us. Many years ago, before we began to go to the moon, those who write sci-fi novels were already projecting into that world. They were not only limited to our world, they were projecting outside of it. That is the film world that I'm propounding, or that I'm pushing here. That when filmmakers are given cinematic license, they're also given that capacity to project, to open up our mind to the availability of many worlds. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Olayan. That's another great point. The only regret thing that everybody has is time. How are we going to? Because these two debates we cannot finish talking about where we decided to move the questions to the same. Otherwise, we'll be on this one and everybody will ask for them. And then by the end, it'll be on the slide. So what we're going to do is that the next presenter, please write the questions. The only privilege that I have is that I can always talk forever with Professor Olayan after this. So, from fact to fiction, films influence on historical perception by Julian Okoye. Are you there, sir? Yes. She's joining version. Okay, she. Oh, sorry, apologies. So she's so. Are we going to be able to hear what you say? Yes. Okay, thank you, sir. Which is ready.
Can you hear me?
Yes, plenty.
Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, professors. I'm so happy I'm the third person because the two previous discussion. Okay. So I'm going to try as much as possible just to be in between. Professor Afolayan, I'm not. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to present on from fact to fiction, films influence on historical perception. Let me try to share my PowerPoint. Let me share my screen. Yes, share. Okay, you see my screen, please?
You can see us right here.
Okay, just let me continue. Okay, so as a dominant mode of storytelling, cinema artfully blends fact and fiction to engage audience. And film serves as vital medium for shaping historical perception and preserving cultural memories. And Yoruba film has significantly contributed to the historical awareness and documentation of the Yoruba history. But regardless, some historical films are fraught with inaccuracies and fictional embellishments. And there is erosion of cultural and historical truth in the pursuit of spectacle and marketability. Many films distort historical fact or blur the lines between myth and documented history for dramatic effect, elevating historical figures into saints, monsters, flattering nuances and complexity. And this is so because many filmmakers, especially mainstream filmmakers, do not take proper consultations. They don't make proper consultations. So the aim of my presentation is to use Adebayo Faliti's Basharun Ga and Austin Peters' House of Ga to evaluate the intersection of historical truth, creative storytelling, and then to analyze how film mediates between documentation and dramatization. I want to highlight the narrative strategies shaping historical perceptions and also examine how two Yoruba historical films reinterpreted the past different ways, and then probably explore artistic license and historical research and cinematic techniques. So to me, research is not optional in historical filmmaking. It is the compass that ensures accuracy, cultural fidelity, and thematic depth. Due to lack of intense research, some of the filmmakers embellish historical narrative, which mostly results in it results in our history being mythologized. And historical films require serious research to responsibly interpret the past without reducing it to mere entertainment. And just like I'm quoting Haynes, and I'm using some of the literature that I have with me. So Haynes, for instance, explains that independent Yoruba filmmakers rely heavily on historical and cultural research to construct credible resonant narrative, particularly epic and historical films. So there are other scholars like Alamo that argues that Nigerian historical films must be grounded in scholarly and archival research to avoid mythologizing the past. Therefore, I'm of the opinion that proper research has evidently helped filmmakers to responsibly interpret the past without reducing it to mere entertainment, to preserve the integrity of historical representation and to avoid misleading audience, to prevent the erosion of historical truth and cultural integrity. For instance, Bolanle Peters drew upon extensive primary and archival sources for a narrative generally. This is evident in 93 Day, which is on Ebola response, and then Fumilayo and Kuti, House of Ga. In one of our interviews on channels, she affirms that on production, they spent 2 years researching Ga's life, and that every prop, line, and costumes had to pass through historical scrutiny. She explains further that to achieve accuracy, she worked closely with Yoruba historians like Professor Akinwumi Ogundiran to ensure that she got the facts right. It is evident from Adebayo Faliti's art history also that he is a profound impact as a scholar, playwright, and cultural custodian. So now let's look side by side, Adebayo Faliti's Basharun Ga and Austin Peters' House of Ga. Well, I'm going to be concentrating on just the characters. I won't want to talk about the setting. I won't want to talk about the costume because already those are complicated. If I start, we won't leave here today because people are complaining about the costume. Some are complaining about the language used, but again, the license is there. So Basharun Ga, the two portrayers, both Basharun Ga and House of Ga, they exploit the tyranny of Ga, drawing from Johnson 1921 strictly. Both films dramatize his reign and fall, but with notable differences in narrative technique. Adebayo Faliti portrays Ga more as an authoritarian and the mythical figure who is cruel, who is feared, who is revered and also portrayed with an exaggerated aura of invisibility, while Austin Peter depicts Ga as counter myth that questions deterministic villainy. In both narrative, actually, Bashorunga uses palace court to tyrannize the Alafin. So let's see his interaction with the Alafin. So I have a comparison between Samuel Johnson, 1921, Bashorunga, 2004, and House of God, 2024. So, for instance, in Samuel Johnson, there is a full documentation of the reign of Ga as Bashorun of Oyo, while Bashorunga omitted this whole story, everything about just it started the story. The story begins towards the end of Obamaji Ogbe, which happens to be the fourth king that happens to rule alongside Ga. So Bashorunga started with Obamaji Ogbe, but on another point, House of Ga portrays the beginning of Ga's reign exactly as documented in Johnson 1921. And also, Johnson affirms that Labisi is the unfortunate prince that was nominated to the vacant throne. But Bashorunga also omitted this fact. While in House of Ga, Labisi is the crown prince, but sits on the throne, and the chiefs refer to him as Kabiesi. So my point exactly is that the fact that the two films are discussing the same thing, the same Bashorunga, the directors, the filmmakers, they have the license to say what they want to say and how they want to say it. So I have a lot of examples that just suppose that differentiates what is documented and accounted in Johnson 1921, what Bashorunga represented, and what House of Ga represented. So I'm going to talk about the artistic license and historical interpretation now. Both Bashorunga and House of Ga exercise a degree of artistic license in their reconstruction of the 18th century or your history, though they do it in distinct ways. While Adebayo Faleti leans heavily into dramatizing villainy, portraying Ga as a mythical embodiment of tyranny, Austin Peters' 2024 adaptation introduces psychological nuance and emotional context to the action. These narrative shifts reflect not only the changes in filmmaking style, but also evolving audience expectations and cultural sensibilities. In both films, events such as Ga rise to power, his influence over the Oyomesi, and his eventual execution are rooted in the historical traditions, yet reinterpreted with dramatic elements. We have fictional dialogue, for instance, has no direct basis in Samuel Johnson's history of Yoruba. Yet, it deepens the film normal arc and personalizes Ga for such deployments of artistic license raise important questions. It raises important questions about not neutral and not accurate, but carefully crafted interpretation of the past. So the two demonstrates artistic storytelling is selectively emphasize certain more ideology messages through historical interpretation. So my point exactly is they are not telling the story, to retell the story, but again, they have the obligation to say it the way it should be said through research, proper research with them, do the needful and do it the right. Exactly is my point. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I think the next person on my list is women. She presented for Judge just seems to investigate. The representation is going to be honored. So, Malaya, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, so you're ready for it.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much. Interesting conversations that we've had so far. And my major presentation today is looking into the movie by Austin Peters, Familiar Ransom Kuti, and looking into how the movie has helped us. Everyone's here. Okay. So I'll go into what the Nigerian space looks like right now when it comes to women in politics, the ideology we currently have, and how this movie helped us rethink how we think of women in politics. So like the first speaker said, when we think of Malaya Ransom Kuti, we often see her as, oh, the first woman to drive a car, probably see her as the mother of Fela Kuti. However, there is more to her. In the Nigerian educational system, right, to some extent, or in some schools, history are not being taught. So you either learn history on your own, like read yourself, you learn from your parents, or you probably read it online with friends and family. And with the recent trends that we have now, is the use of Nollywood in helping us with this history. And another recent trend we have is like political leaders, also coming back with like books to tell us the history. So then it's very difficult for us to know what exactly our history is with so many looking at the fact that women and women population within Nigeria is almost of equal level, that would also have enough women in political system. However, we have less women. We have like less than 20% of women in House of, we have like just 20 women. And then in the Senate, it's about 4 women to some extent, 4 to 6 women in the Senate. And then when we have this discussion on why we don't have women in there, we start to say things like, oh, women are probably not exactly fit to be leaders. Women are probably so emotional. And the most interesting one that people tend to talk about now, which I find very funny, is the idea of, oh, it's not part of our culture to have women as leaders. And it has become a trend when it comes to women oppression, is when we remember what is not our culture and what exactly is our culture. So a very interesting thing that I find about Familiar Ransom Kuti, the movie itself, is the way that it helps us say, oh, pause, go back. Women have always been part of leadership in our culture. So I'm looking into how film could be like a corrective to historical omission, especially seeing that we don't have enough resources to help us within how history really works. So I'll be looking into like women in Nigerian political history. We'll look into like the analysis of the movie itself, and then we are going to look into film as an historical method, more like the question somebody asked earlier, as like a memory, a collective memory that we all share. And we look into like the audience reception and impact, just to see like how did the movie influence how we began to rethink women in politics. And then we'd also be looking into like the implications for doing history with film. So one of the common misconceptions we often have with women in political history, or that is often very common with like Nigerian movies or the way society sees it as deemed fit, is that we often see women as like bystanders in Nigerian political history. And in fact, when we talk about political history in Nigeria, we start from like the military era all to like the civilian era right now. And for some reasons, the issue of this is like omitted. We don't really hear about them at all in any way. So as time goes on, it becomes like a part of our reality to think that, okay, because so many women there, because we are not hearing about so many women in politics, then it basically means that like it's not part of our culture, when it has always been part of our culture. Yeah. And then women, like I said earlier, see maybe like the major movies that we've seen so far where we see like the man as the main one. Like for example, in Anikulapo, to some extent, it was really, which Anikulapo is probably not exactly an historical one, I would say, which I might probably be wrong, but we could see that it was his wife that found the charm and gave it to her husband to try to support him in a way, not exactly seeing her as like the powerful one, which is, and this understanding of our past. Something feel like familiar Kuti by Bolanle Austin Peters are instrumental in reversing the erasure of presenting women not as victims, but as leaders and visionary within the Nigerian system. So just a little talking to the life of Funmilayo Ransome Kuti. So she was basically the first female student in Abeokuta Grammar School. And from the way the movie showed us that, like standing up to the men, they're trying to bully and Tina as, oh, how will you come into our space? Why are you here? And all of those things. And in fact, one of the major things this shows us is like the recent ideology that went on Twitter recently, where people were saying things like, oh, show us in part of Nigerian history where women were never allowed to go into schools, or tell us a time when Nigeria itself didn't allow women to go into school. This movie basically showed our ideology into that, seeing that there was not exactly a law that says women could not go to school. However, the structures in place made it impossible for women to go to school to some extent. And we'll see some pictures like our forefathers probably share with us. You probably are seeing two girls, you're seeing two, three girls in a class of like, let's say 50 people. And then people still come out in like a biased way to say, oh, women will never stop to go to school. But like our culture, our structures in place made it impossible. And one of the things this movie showed us was how like even when she was talking to her father in the movie, she was like, oh, she can't go to Lagos because Lagos was the only place that had schools for women. So it was not like if your family could not afford to send you from every part of Nigeria to Lagos, then it means you just had to be. But her father was one of those persons who supported and like basically fought for her to find a space in that place. So this basically helped us understand the whole idea of like, oh, women were not allowed in schools. However, there was no law, but there was no structure in place. And that was one of the things it showed us. And then Funmilayo also like founded the Abeokuta Women's League Union, which led the 1947 tax revolt, which mobilized like over 10,000 women and forced the Alake to back down in the whole tax increment that he had. And then she also served as the Western House of Chiefs, co-founded in Nigerian Women's Union, and she have received so many prizes and also like represented the country in so many ways. And to some part of history, they also see her as one of those who also contributed to like the independence of Nigeria. So going to the movie again, one of the strengths of movies in general is it helps us visualize things. So you could probably read history on your own, but you are left to your own interpretation. You are left to your own imagination of it. But with movies, it brings it to life. And there's something we call entertainment education, where you basically use movies to educate people. But it definitely has to go through a series of research to ensure that like you're showing people the factual one. But you also have to include the entertainment part of it so people don't get bored and it doesn't become a documentary eventually, but it becomes more of it something people are entertained by, but also at the same time they live with something that educates them. So this movie brought out like the motive storytelling that helps us bring everything to life. Like she was very much relatable. It was more like we're seeing the sequence of her life from A to Z. And one of the things people talked about online was how much they were able to like connect with watching that. And also scenes from like the 1947 protests basically show the power of collective women resistance. And to some extent, it educated us on the idea of, if we all come together as a collective, there's basically nothing we cannot do to some extent. And the film also dignified our relationship with our son while also centering our own legacy. And another interesting thing this movie did was, the current ideology we have is, oh, you cannot be a feminist and be married because so many people do not even understand what feminism means. And then this movie showed us how she was basically that, and she still had a marriage. She still had a relationship with her family. She still had a relationship with her husband. In fact, she had an husband who was very much supportive of everything she wanted to do. So it was more like she tried to make time for both of it. So, this movie corrected the ideology of you could be a feminist, but at the same time, you could fight for what you think is right and just for the society. So, again, it's just more than a movie. It's a powerful reclamation of history through. And then major limitations that this movie had that some people mentioned was like the use of English language. And my argument for this is being where the movie was shown, which was on, even though it's our history, like most people who probably would be watching it were probably not like Yoruba speakers. And so we needed to tell our history, not just only to like the Yoruba indigents, but to everybody who could watch, who wants to learn about the Nigerian history or learn about this woman. So to some extent, the use of English could be something that could be used just to reach greater audiences. And some of the other things was like, secondary characters were not fully developed. And that could be because there's just never enough space in movies. So you probably have like 2 hours to capture people's attention to sit down and watch something. Like it would be very disastrous when we start to go into various characters that to some extent we lose the plot of the movie that we want to watch, or they move the plot of the story that we're actually trying to give. So people are talking about like the mother of showing was mentioned briefly, and some other people were mentioned briefly as well, that they probably will want to learn their story. But the thing is, the movie was about like, some historical complexity. Absolutely. We're not expecting to see like a movie capture every part. Like the major goal was supposed to be captured out was for us to see like how men have been like an important part of it. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'm almost. Oh, okay. All right. So now next is like film as an historical method. So one of the things that we're coming up with this trend, although this is something very common within the Western culture, where they use movies as well to tell stories too. And for us as well, it could become more than just an entertainment, more of an historical method for us, where we basically learned about like how movie could help us connect more about things, how we could use movies to tell our story more, how we could also use movies to like change this whole ideology, and could also see movie function like archive, which basically brings untold story, big good or bad, at least see what it is. Specifically in the technological world where people seeing is believing, going back to read. So with others' reception to the movie, one of the things you really brought up was, people finally gave Fumilayo a due recognition, and I appreciated that focus on like women's strength, unity, and leadership, and the movie renewed in feminism issues. And one of the important things that I like that this movie did was help us rethink how we thought of feminism and thought of like women within like the Nigerian political space. And then implications for doing film has become like a vital tool in public history, especially in like African context, where oral history and cultural memories are strong. So it might be like a family related issues that we might have in making movie as part of our history, but with the trends that we already have with like Lisha B, then if we continue that trend, we will do all of this. All right. Thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you, Fumilayo. Now, our last presenter is very much on Hollywood history. So let me take his history about Samson and Luapo. Mulabi from Mulabi Southern National University. Okay.
Okay, I'm talking of three instruments semantic shift, and I'll be looking into the points of textual dimensions that arises out of it. When we look at the images of the Nollywood focusing on the history about movies, it brings about, it questions the ethical dimensions legislation of these movies. One of those things that we must and we need to acknowledge is the fact that Nollywood create the memories in the heart of people, and it's giving some knowledge to people, most especially the young ones. When they watch some movies that believe that issues, it is being believed that everything they are watching, they can boost their own, they know the history of this particular place. And our question now is, how do we know that what we need is actually correct? How do we know that this knowledge is actually correct? When we look at movies like Jagun Jagun, where it was being painted of Agemo, and it was a female that was wearing the Agemo. And you can believe it, that that's the right thing. And but when you now begin to look into it, you begin to see that the knowledge that was being passed in is wrong. In the normal Yoruba tradition, a woman is not even allowed to see Agemo. So how come we are now painting Agemo as a woman? So what knowledge are we trying to pass across like that? Now, speaking from Aristotle, Aristotle was talking about an artist that yes, while you are trying to paint a picture, you can try and add your own view, your own perspective to it. But the question now is, if we are, because of entertainment, then we are now trying to change some things, make some adjustments to the history. How do we want people to rely on those information? So one of those questions is, how it is important question of ethics embedded in the notion of truth? How are we sure of the truth in those movies? Now let's say for another instance in this the movie of Richard, how it was painted was like as if Richard is only him. And the question is it true that Richard is him? Then when we begin to question those things, then we begin to see that there is a need for us to visit the knowledge of the movies we are portraying to people. Another issue there is Plato's skepticism, talking about representation in his public. And he warns against distorting a potential artist's mind, arguing that artists do not present truth, but rather imitation of reality can lead mislead audience. So if the man applied to historical Nollywood, this view suggests that the film is risking the knowledge that people they are going to acquire. Is going to affect the substance. It means we just watch those movies just for entertainment, for the sake of entertainment. But the substance itself, we can't rely on it. I too. On the other hand, talked about an artist representation and the need of uncovering deeper philosophical truths. Having the poetics that an art does not merely imitate life, but review universal principles. So if you are talking from this point of view, we can say that okay, it does not really mean that we have to take every truth. We have to paint every truth in the movie. But we should just pass some information, some principles. But what about our audience? What about the people? How do they know that everything is not the truth? How do they know that some of those things are for the sake of entertainment? And another thing is the identity. Let's talk about our identity. Sometimes when we see this Nollywood, it seems like we try to ridicule our identity. Look at when you watch some of them, you see that, oh, because it's a tradition and history, then you now see them having a black teeth. Are we literally saying that Africans don't have a good hygiene? That's another point of view that we need to look into. Now, the epistemological question of whether film can ever fully capture historical reality, they have been explored by different people. Adorno argues that mass media tends to commodify truth, reducing history to a spectacle that aligns with the narrative of culture. Now, when we apply it to historical film, Nollywood, we see that they often now shape history to market demands and audience expectation rather than objective commitment to history. So this call for a need for us to examine Nollywood historical film. If we are claiming that this is an historical film, then we should be very conscious of pointing out the truth, not just focusing on entertainment or the market demand, but also be conscious of our African identity. Another point that I want to talk about is about the African philosophy and historical representation. Now, African philosophy provides a fun framework for evaluating ethical dimension of historical film. Historical film. Now, it also argues that African identity is innately communal, where history consciousness is shaped by collective memory rather than individual experience. So what it means that there is a need for, now you want to make this movie, there is a need for you to consult the historians. There is a need for you to consult people that can give us precision and accuracy on how the costume and how the settings should be. Not that we are saying we are history, and the next thing we are saying is we are saying some recent technology, the use of some recent technologies that they don't have those time. And we now begin to ask ourselves, are we truly painting the right thing today? And that thing is the usable past in African history. But I explain that the discourse on historical representation in Nollywood should serve as for oriented towards future aspirations. Like when we are talking about the Nollywood, it should serve for a future aspiration. It should be a place where people can learn much about our tradition, where they can learn about our identity. If care is not taken, when people that are not Africans, when people that are not from your tradition are watching, they believe that it is being written, produced by someone from the community. And they believe that all the ideas, they are thinking the ideas of how their community is or their identity. Then we begin to have a misrepresentation of our identity. Now let's look into the metaphysical question underlying knowledge influence in shaping memories. Is whether history exists independently on its representation. Vocal notions of historical discourse, which argues that history is not objective reality, but a construct shaped by power dynamic. Now, as Nollywood a force in Nigerian cultural production, it has power in shaping how history is perceived and remembered. So this can complicate matters when we are not giving what is right to people. Now, in suggesting that, a philosopher White was suggesting that all historical narrative should not just be based on individual. There should be a communal ideas. There should be a part of people coming together, giving their views, telling you the right thing of how it is being done. So that we will not just be having stories that are not. We will not just have these stories that are mixed up with our own personal view, which will not protect our history, which will not protect our identity. Now, I will be concluding with the fact that Nollywood filmmakers have a special obligation to balance entertainment and historical accuracy in a manner that promotes a shared sense of viewership. This sense of historical engagement encourages audience to reflect on their own historical while situating themselves within contemporary social dilemma.
Thank you very much, sir. So we have just 4 minutes more, and then I think there's a hand that's perpetually up. So we are going to start with the command and flags, and then I think Congressman after that we see. I think please let's go. Questions they are short. I mean, I'll still ask you. Let's go with it. And you then speak.
And sometimes I have what I have here as the of support for the first speaker. Looking for talk to technical evidence. So I just like 10 years old, So we have the other here. Then, so, well, what we have, what we have to fix, the things that genre. So you're saying you have fiction, futuristic genre, where the artist very few to express whatever he wants. But if you are dealing with historical topics that has particular names in the history of the people, then one was that you're not really trying to one way or the other. I'm not quite saying but then if we consider our situation in Africa, you find that the African filmmaker is thinking about two issues. One is the fact that colonial is targeting our stories from that perspective. So it is necessary for a filmmaker to try as much as possible change the narrative with truth. One.
Thank you.
Then
That's what we are on that case.
no, I don't just put that in.
And then not make it.
Okay. Okay. Now, all right. What I want to say, the fact that simply done does not mean that it's free from moral responsibility. For instance, you can't say that because I have simply done, you want to show a film of 1970, and you're showing the character that will be holding a consistent mass. So that simply was simply what just apply. So after that.
That's very good. My name is Daniel. Take it fast. So my question is for the first question is for everyone, all the presenters. Does film, especially historical and biographical non-fiction, do they hold us the obligation, giving us an omniscient view of things? That's the very first question. Because we speak of these films as if they have the responsibility to present absolute truth. We speak highly of our expectations of those films. That's the very first question. And then we say that the second question is for you, ma'am. You talked about stereotypes, about profiling women in certain ways in whole Nollywood, and how the new ones are trying to reclaim narratives. I'm saying, my question is that, is this not just the actual reflection of broader social issues? In the past, these women were not really given. This is just how things were in the real society, right? A woman was expected to be in the house, cooking for her husband, raising children. In many, I don't know, I've not been alive for so long, but I believe that this is how we met this world. Women had limitations, and I don't know who imposed those. I don't know who imposed those limitations. But I believe that when those films show women in certain ways, or maybe they are not actually elaborating on their roles, I believe that this is just a reflection of broader social issues, not as an imperfection of the film itself. It's a broader reflection of something. So another question is, no. I'm sorry. We expect. The last question is, we expect history is to become to be factual. When in itself, the people who made this history, the people who made history themselves, we are not entirely perfect. We are not able to account truly for the actual details of their life. What makes up fact? Who determines what story is factual? What is the bias, the individual biases? We have different views. My story can be different from the story. So I am assuring you that you cannot remember tomorrow that you had a good paper, like a pamphlet, which that has the word memory on it. Because we are trying to recall from memory. And this is obviously flawed in itself. So why do we expect that these films, historical films, should depict fact? And who determines which story is correctly factual and which one is not? All right. You're part of that. So Kenneth, and then that's my brother over there. And so after these three people, because we're already running, there's another session coming up. There's still another, there's a part two to this.
Yeah, there's a
so you can resolve your question and ask me. So Kenneth, please make it fast. And you make it fast. So, okay. And please speak last. Thank you. Reality.
which are stage and professor. British Africans are that's the function. Professor Simon said, we didn't, I think it's nice. My friend there talked about that. It's hospital. What's the plan? So down to my question is, how we get people out the market against demand? The pressure can you very important. It will transfer the keep them.
So there's not.
Whatever.
Yes.
Thank you.
Was a trust
Just people understand.
you ask where is treating well, and I said to my it's not says no fee as coming. So please come there and
What's the occasion?
what extent days after and that is said to I don't or subjective as you can. Many years after can have event of actually like a community. People relations many years after that someone come and discuss that is the country. Even for
Thank you. Please. Thank you very much, for sharing. I just want to ask if we will cross the definition of school what's less.
Okay, I start. Let me just try to be very brief. You see, one of the reasons why we're talking about this retelling to be as close to the truth of the historical events as possible is to depict the true nature of gender roles. And one of the things, that you have been influenced to believe is that these stereotypical roles that are associated with women is how it has always been. And that is not true. In traditional African societies, our women were not restricted to the private sector. They operated freely in the public sector. Read Oyerunke Oyerube's The Invention of Women. He talks a bit about that and how, because of the imposition of the Victorian ideology of the colonialists, we now have this notion of the fact that a woman is the weaker sex who must be protected from temptation. It wasn't so in the traditional African culture. Talk about the major tribes, which is what I have researched. Talk about Igbo, talk about Hausa, talk about Yorubas. Women operated freely in the public sphere. In Hausa land, for example, before Islam came and they adopted it, you had women as tax collectors, you had women doing the civil jobs, working for the kings and the queens. In Yoruba land, women, you had the Yamlo days, you had women. Look at Tomilayo Ransom Kuti and how she brought that picture out. You had people like Efunsheto and Anibura. If they were restricted to the private sphere, we would have someone like Efunsheto who was renowned for her wealth to the extent that, the male chiefs planned and conspired against her, which eventually led to her death. So this is what we're telling, that these historical narratives should, when they are being told, when they are being shown in movies, should represent how, at least as much as possible, the facts of the matter and these events are caught.
Thank you. There's no way we can answer all these questions, but two perspectives for me. Every viewing is a perspective. So the lady was capturing these events. If we view what she captured some 10 years later, would we say that she captured this entire thing? No, she captured a perspective that is significant or that she was told to capture. She viewed us. She maybe limited view. Part of viewing this event would be to capture all this, to capture the fan, to capture the fact that somebody was fanning himself constantly here, to capture all these things. But it will not be complete because when Tunde Kelani did Ayinla, he captured a perspective of Ayinla's life. Ayinla was about to go to London. and they couldn't go. But that is not, so anybody looking at that film 10 years, what are we going to say is viewing? Do you understand? That's one. Two, I watched Exodus. That film is significant for me because we have a view about the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. And what we have in the scripture is the water. But when that guy came to that point, the water receded. That is more believable for me than a body of water that we call the Red Sea passing by the side. In fact, when I got to that point, I was on the edge of my seat. I wanted to see what the guy would do. And then the water started going down, and I felt I applauded. So when I said that filmmakers open up our mind to better understanding, better perspective, that is what I mean. That sometimes when they do this, they give us a perspective of this is another way to view this matter, rather than the one that is orthodox or, you know. I can't answer. We will talk after. We will.
And I think that's something very important that we need to think about. I mean, art, someone suggested it's selective. And then, you know, what goes out there is determined by who is doing that art.
Yes.
And the truth, and we're just discussing with Professor Online, there's something Achebe calls the truth of fiction. So truth can be subjective.
Yes.
What is true 10 years ago,
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
the meaning will change now. So that affects that focus. So we can talk from now to whatever. Art is not as restrictive as we think. And whatever someone vision, there is, you know, it's the vision.
Yeah.
If we look at this same thing, your understanding of it will be different from mine. So that's your vision of it, interpretation. So all these things are subjective and they are reflected in those films. Someone talked about the woman. I mean, yeah, I think it was, you know, the woman played. Why is the woman playing that role? There is a reason. There are ideological reasons for all those things. Yeah, so I think you have any questions.
There's a question.
So any questions? I mean, okay, I think you want to talk to. Okay. Those that are online, does anyone want to respond?
Online.
Okay.
We have 2 minutes. Another session is starting in 5 minutes.
So all right, then if we have 2 minutes, can we just allow these two people who are assistants?
Easy with that.
Okay. After you, then my brother invite.
Now have less than 2 minutes.
Okay, so I want to quickly react to the moral burden we are forcing on artists. I don't think any artist has a new moral burden. What an artist can do is to achieve what we call verisimilitude. Believability. Who wants his believability? Beyond that, I don't think an artist has the moral verification.
Maybe then that's context.
All right. So, from the illustration,
Yes, sir.
this, the what's record, there will never be a time when you want that thing, and you now show that, the person did that intention of something, and you present a comment. So that part is remain contact. Not one thing.
That's
That established.
Thank you.
Yeah, you talk about very simple. One can, you can invent a name, a fictional name, in history, and use the story of a known figure in history to do whatever man you want to do. But the moment you mention that figure in history, they can't really relate the past. That's right.
Okay, thank you very much, guys. I think this is really wonderful.
Yeah.
I appreciate you guys. And the good gist is that there is a second part. There's a second part. So if you look at the program, I think that one is coming up in 2020. And then, you know, I think I'll be talking too. So I really wish that we will see you guys. Honestly, I'm very encouraged. I've go to conferences where you present about just and then you are not just here, you are participated actively. I'm very, very proud of you guys. Thank you. Thank you. And you can